she set the scene superbly, very superbly. So, in some ways I'll recap and give some of her messages in a slightly different format. And this is what we need to say is that, yes, number one, we have to move to a renewable energy economy. We have to stop emissions. That is non-negotiable. But unfortunately, it is not enough. In Copenhagen, for those of you who were there, but everybody knows that they said, we will keep the world at 2 degrees warming. What does that mean? That's actually 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. This year, we tipped at certain times 400 parts per million, and we know that next year the average will be 400 parts per million. So we've missed it. We've missed 2 degrees. We're on track between 3.5 and 5 degrees. 3.5 is the best case scenario, highly unlikely. And 4 degrees is regarded as catastrophic climate change and the point of no return. So to say that if we went to a fully renewable economy and we got to 3.5, half a degree below catastrophic climate change, as a good outcome, I find it totally unacceptable. We have to start looking at how we can turn it around. I just want to explain why, if we just went to renewables, it wouldn't work. All the greenhouse gases we've got in the atmosphere now will have a cumulative effect for at least 100 and some up to 500 years from now, for instance, nitrous oxide. According to the World Meteorological Organization, their secretary, a week before this COP started, said that the carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, and the oceans even longer. Past, present, and future emissions will have an cumulative impact on both global warming and ocean acidification. We need to draw excess CO2 out of the atmosphere. The other one is the 350. Everybody knows 350.org. That came out of that we've achieved it to 2 degrees. 2 weeks before this COP, a very good report came out showing that 2 degrees means all the low island countries, the Atoll Islands, will disappear. A place like Bangladesh, 40 to 50 million people will be displaced. Coastal cities like New York City, New Orleans, Mumbai, Calcutta, Bangkok, Manila, Jakarta will displace millions. 280 million. And I think Hunter showed it beautifully what happened with the Arab Spring in Syria, just displacing a few million. What does 280 million mean? It's a world that we won't be able to cope with. We also know that the frequency of extreme events are increasing, according to NASA and the World Meteorological Organization, that what used to be 1 in 30-year events, extreme events, are now 1 in 5, and that frequency and severity will increase. We're already in climate change. So what do? Well, we actually only have one option, and that is go back to pre-industrial levels. And what does that mean? Well, we have to go to 278 parts per million. It means we have to take 122 parts per million out of the atmosphere. So that's, I suppose you could say, bad news. But as Hunter said, this is actually a story of hope. As Hunter said, we don't need to invent anything new. We have everything in place now to reverse climate change. Every bit of technology we need. There is nothing that needs to be invented. We just need to do it. The most important one is this equation, the very basis of life. We get 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 of water, use solar energy through photosynthesis, and we make glucose, which which is the basis of life with a byproduct of oxygen. And that is what every living thing comes from. Glucose is where our carbohydrates, we change it, our hydrocarbons, our fats and oils. We add nitrogen to it, we make proteins, amino acids, and so on and so on. And when we look at any plant, 95 to 98% of its biomass, its minerals, are water, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. It's usually only 2%, up to 5% that comes from the soil. But when a plant grows, about 30% of the carbon that it fixes, its roots put into the soil as free carbon to feed the living soil. The soil is living, and microorganisms build that into stable forms of carbon, soil organic matter. As a result, the soils are actually the greatest sink of carbon after the oceans. Oceans are the greatest sink, but we know we cannot put any more carbon into the ocean than we can in the atmosphere. The oceans are in trouble, as we know. We will lose coral reefs in our lifetime at the rate that they are degrading. We have about 575 gigatons in wood, in biomass, about 848 gigatons in the atmosphere. We have 2,700 gigatons in the soil. Now, just to give you some maths, some basic maths of what 122 parts per million means, that's 946 gigatons of CO2. But if we turn it into carbon, which is the first three lines, 250 gigatons of carbon. To put 250 gigatons into 2,700 is not a big task. Can we do it with agriculture? Well, I'll just show you two examples, and we have hundreds of examples of systems that can do it. So if we look at from the Rodale, the Rodale Compost Utilization Trial in Pennsylvania, the Rodale Institute, when they did a long-term trial, they found that they could sequester 8 tons, 8,000 kilograms of CO2 per hectare per year. If we extrapolate that by agricultural lands, that is 40 gigatons of CO2. That means if we could, with that system, we could take 24 years to reverse climate change. It took us 250 years to get here. To say by adopting regenerative agricultural practices, we could reverse it in 24 years. That is incredible. That means for our children and grandchildren, we can go back to pre-industrial levels in most of their lifetimes. Hunter showed what we call regenerative or holistic grazing. And this is actually one of the best systems for building up carbon. And here's an example of a study just published this year looking at the degenerated grazing lands in the southwest of the USA. And without going into all the maths, we're basically saying if we extrapolate that just by the figures, the FAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture figures for grazing lands, we could reverse climate change, take that 122 million out in just 10 years. That's just two examples. We have many, many examples. So what I want to say here is that we can do it. But the other thing which is really important is not just mitigation. We are already in climate change. We're already seeing droughts and floods and all the problems. The other thing that the science shows, by increasing soil organic matter, by using regenerative practices, you can get much better adaptation to these weather events. These are scientific studies looking at organic agriculture showing that when it comes to weather extremes such as heavy rains and droughts, organic systems have higher yields. And I want to explain one of it, and this is multifunctional, the benefits of organic matter. And I've only got a short time, so I can't go into all the benefits. But this is work done by one of our master students in Australia to show the advantages for water capture and storage. Most soils are degrading. Most soils used to be between 4 and 6% organic matter. Through bad farming, we degraded those soils, and that carbon in the soil has gone up in the atmosphere as CO2. Most soils between 1% or less, so it means when it rains per hectare in the root zone, in the first foot, you can capture between 80 to 160,000 litres. Any extra rain will just run off, usually with the topsoil, and flood rivers and creeks and muddy them. If we can get them back to where they were, say up to 6%, and I put 6% there because in my own farm I went from 0.5% to 6% in 11 years. Will, I know, did better than me. He did about the same in about 5 or 6 years. We have many examples of farms who can do this. What it means, if you get up to 6%, when it rains, you can capture around a megalitre per hectare and keep it at the root zone. You don't need to build megalitre dams and irrigate it. You've got it just where you want it, at the root zone. And what does it mean? Well, this is an example of the Rodale trial. The same soil, same crop next to each other. One, every year has been using organic practices where we've been incrementally increasing the soil organic matter through the right processes and building it up. The other is good practice conventional, which has actually been slightly degrading it. It's a drought, but because the organic one has captured that water and stored it, it doesn't know it has a drought. It's growing beautifully. The conventional now, the yield is collapsing. And those previous studies that I showed you, that's what we see, that in these extremes, the conventionals collapse, the organic keeps much the same yield. So the independent peer review by Professor David Pimentel from Cornell University shows, on average in drought years, the organic systems get around 30% higher. Now this is critical information as we go into climate change for our food security. So what we're talking about is farming systems that will not only help us reverse climate change, but ensure we have food security. And what I want to really end on, I think the most important thing here is why we need to do it. The real story is that we need to talk about living agricultural systems, not just about carbon in the soil. We need to talk about communities. An example I want to give is Tigray, in Ethiopia. For those people who are old enough to remember the Live Aid concerts, where Bob Geldof and everyone, this is about Tigray. Because of bad land management, people were dying in droughts. Food security is so bad, it killed people. One of our members, our IFO members, the Institute of Sustainable Development, worked with the people, worked with them to manage grazing. We have one of our members here, Precious Theory from Zimbabwe, who talked about she's doing the same with her people, and how you can actually bring in grazing, but start looking at whole living systems, look at communities, work at landscape level. So revegetate the hillsides. It's not about stopping grazing, it's about how we manage it. Put in legumes in the fields, restore erosion, rehabilitate gullies. So we're looking at working at a complete landscape level, at a holistic level. Plant legume trees like sesbanias and long grasses to bring in biodiversity in the fields. But what you can do now when you have all this biomass is start composting it and putting it on the fields to grow your crops. And I want to end on this slide. This is a very important one, published by FAO. It's 900 samples from farmers over 7 years, so you have a high level of confidence. This is the traditional system, the yield, the one where they had food insecurity. This is the compost. More than 100% increase in yield. This is where this wasn't designed to be an organic experiment. People were allowed to use chemical fertilizers. But they quickly realized that using compost that had higher yields, it cost them nothing, this cost them money, they went to debt to buy it. So farmers changed. what this meant, it took these people from abject poverty that killed people through to food security and prosperity, to good food. The creeks and rivers are flowing now. My wife and I, we've actually been, Steve, this is my last slide, so I'm finishing up. Been there and seen it. The people are prosperous. They're eating good food. The children, particularly the girls, are going to school. Normally, if they've got money to send children to school, it's the girls that miss out. And the youth are returning back to the villages because they have a future. They're no longer thinking, oh, we have to leave to Addis Ababa. In many of our farming communities, our biggest export is our children. It's such a wonderful thing to see the children back. I think one of the stories which you never even think of, because everybody thinks it's about production and food, this is about people and communities. The women could now buy nice clothes. And people go, well, what does that mean? Well, they actually had clothes with holes in it. They felt indecent. They could not socialise. So they were socially isolated. Now they could socialise. Now you get the sense of community, sense of well-being, sense of empowerment. So what I want to end on is that what we are looking at here is more than just, look, we're going to reverse climate change. We're going to regenerate whole communities, end poverty. This is one of the great stories. And I'm giving this as an example because we're doing it now. We know it works. We don't need to invent anything. We just need to scale it up. And that will be to the benefit of all of us. Thank you.